we're back with a little bit more about Pandora's box and how I opened it with that last video, or the video. It's been 2 or 3 videos now. I've actually enjoyed this. This is cool stuff. I like talking about these things. I love talking about these things. Some people like to hear about them. Some, or at least a couple, or maybe just one. One guy doesn't like to hear about this stuff. He just wants me to start talking about tips and tricks about how catching fish. And I'll be honest with you guys. This whole deal about what we're talking about, like, this is the tip. This is the trick. Everyone wants all these little things that they think they're going to do to these baits to all of a sudden magically make fish bite. I got a secret for y'all. Okay? Get ready for this. This is a big one. I don't even like sharing it on YouTube. It's so big. And it's really just for this guy. And I'm going to whisper it. You can't catch a fish if he ain't there. Okay? If it ain't there, I don't care all the tricks you do to your baits and all these tips and all these things on YouTube. None of them are going to help if you're casting out there and that fish isn't there. Okay? And that's what we're going to talk about today. That's what the whole video was about, is, are we moving fish? Yes, it's about pressure and this and that and all these things. But if we're moving fish and the fish are moving and you're still casting at the same old thing where a fish isn't, then what does it matter? All those things, none of it matters. So I'm trying to give y'all a little bit of insight and to think a little bit about maybe why you're not getting bit. Because that's way more important than all these tips and tricks. Because let me tell you something. It's the one thing I've figured out over time, right? A lot of the times you're just not throwing by fish when you're not getting bit. Okay? That's the deal. That's usually the case. It's usually not your bait. There's times, yes, when bait matters, but there's so many times that you're just not physically casting by a fish. So, we're going to get into something today that's got brought up. And it's probably like the most obvious statement that's ever made, but it's not true, or it's not always true. How about that? It's definitely not always true. And the statement is always this. You've heard it 1,000 times. Hey, if you find the bait, you'll find the fish. Well, that was a statement that I really could care less about growing up. I wouldn't say it made no sense, but I'll give you my opinion on that. Okay? Like everything else about all this stuff, it's my opinion and it's about what I've seen. Okay? And it's what I've seen. And the one thing I've always said is, if you always see, I never give y'all absolutes in any of these videos, because I don't think there are any absolutes in fishing. What I've seen is things that go on, and then things that don't really make sense either. So the bait deal. I grew up on Lake Livingston. Lake Livingston probably has more shad in it than any lake in Texas, maybe in the country. The place is ridiculously loaded with shad. I'll tell you how good it is with shad. It's probably the #1 catfish lake in the country. Okay? It's one of the only lakes I know of that you can have a double limit of catfish per person. That means you can catch 50 catfish a day and keep them. Now, why is that important? What's the one thing catfish eat? Shad. It's also one of the best white bass lakes in the country. What do they eat? Shad. It has that many shad in it. So when you tell someone, a kid that was growing up at the time on Lake Livingston, hey, when you heard the thing, if you find bait, you'll find bass. Well, I could go throw a cast net around Livingston pretty much anywhere I wanted to at all times of the year, at all times, and get bait. I go out there and catch 50 shad. Bass weren't in there with them. So the bait thing wasn't always relative to me. I then moved to Rayburn, or started fishing Rayburn more and fishing these certain lakes. I didn't have a graph, right? I was fishing off the bank. I was fishing out of boats without graphs. I didn't know if bait was in the area. I just looked up. I was fishing a boat dock. I was fishing some rocks. I was fishing some grass. And I was going, well, wait a minute. It's a lake, man. There's always bait around. I'm fishing the shoreline. I can see in the water there's bait. There weren't always bass there. And sometimes I wouldn't see bait, and then I'd be catching bass. Like, It didn't always tie in. Now, is it true that you go out there and find a whole bunch of bait sometimes and there's fish with them? Well, yeah, but isn't that obvious? Like, there's almost always going to be fish around some bait somewhere. So, yeah, chances are if you find some fish, there's probably bait around there too. But I can also drive around a lot of these lakes, especially now, especially in the wintertime. As we get closer to the wintertime, all those shad and all that bait, and even if you don't have shad, but all that bait starts going deeper. And a lot of times you can idle for hundreds and thousands of yards and just see bait constantly. Well, there's no fish with them. There's bait out there, but there's no fish. So it's not always find the bait, find the fish. Why I bring that up is everyone's always like, well, the bass are moving where the bait is. No. When I talked about throwing that swim jig and throwing that stuff along the bank, and if you read some of these comments from people are commenting about things that they have witnessed over a 10-year span. And I applaud y'all. I applaud y'all guys that are going, yeah. I used to go here and do this for years, and now I can't do it anymore. What you think bait all of a sudden just stopped being there? Something else is going on. That's what we're trying to figure out. Because there's always bait in the grass. Now, it might not be bait you can see. It might be crawfish. There's always perch in the grass. There's all kinds of things. A bass is not picky in the sense of, I don't care if it's a crappie this big, a perch this big, baby carp, baby gar, baby bass. Bass are going to eat all those things. It don't matter. Like, man, they're just opportunistic fish. So they're always going to be bass in the grass because there's always bait in the grass, right? But there's not necessarily always a bunch of bass in the grass. Like, that's the crazy part, is that there might be more bait in the grass than out there deep, and yet they're out there deep. And maybe they're feeding on shad. Maybe. I caught one the other day. Maybe I can find the video of it if I've got it. It was the most horrible looking fish ever. Maybe it was just sick, thin as could be. Right? Sometimes you catch fish in the grass that are really just absolutely blown out. Sometimes you catch them out there absolutely blown out. There's still bait in both of those areas. So when we're talking about fish moving and why they're moving, or why they're not showing up in places, and I'm not talking about specific spots necessarily, but them just moving from what they used to do 10 to 15 years ago to now, I don't think it's bait causing that, right? I don't think bait all of a sudden started moving because bass started feeling pressure from fishermen, right? Or from technology or from whatever it is. If that's the case, like I said, bass are moving because they can go from here where bait is and over here to where bait is. They can move around with that and be just fine. And that's what we're trying to figure out. It's why those bass are moving. If you can start figuring that out, it's going to help you catch more fish. Because maybe instead of sitting on the bank and going, man, I remember when we used to catch them like this all the time, you'll move away from the bank and try figuring out something different. That's what we're trying to figure out. That's what I'm wanting y'all to think about when you go out on these lakes. Going, okay, it's kind of like fishing history, right? It's hard, guys. How do you go against something you've been doing for years and go, I got to throw all that away because stuff has changed, right? That's the hard part. That's what I'm trying to get y'all. And I can't specifically tell you on your lake what that change is because it's different for all these lakes. We're having to figure out. I'm having to figure it out, right? At Gunnersville, when I was there for the championship, you heard all these guys talking about how it used to be a flipping bite. It used to be flipping the grass. That was the way to win. That was the way to catch them. You might sit there and go, well, maybe live scope is the new way to catch them out there. Maybe so. Maybe that's the new way to win. But what it doesn't explain, it's why those guys couldn't go out there and catch them flipping as good as they used to, right? Maybe this is a better technique to win nowadays. I don't know, but say maybe it is. But why all of a sudden did they stop catching them flipping the grass when there's all that grass out there, right? And in their heads, those guys are trying to figure out how not to fish history because they've done it for so many years. And it doesn't make sense for them to stop doing it. Is there more people flipping? No, not really. There's a whole bunch of other guys doing all this stuff. There's probably less guys flipping, and still it's not as good. That's kind of like my swim jig deal. Yeah, more guys are throwing a swim jig, but you know what? I've gone out there a lot and don't see anyone throwing a swim jig. So why all of a sudden did the swim jig bite not be as good as it was 10 years ago? I don't know if it's pressure. I don't think they're up there as good. And why are they not up there as good? That I can't explain. That one's become the harder one. And what's crazy is I'm going to do more of these videos because there's so much different ideas and different concepts about them. I'm not taking these concepts and saying you're right or you're wrong. I'm just looking at it from a different point of view sometimes and going, okay, I hear what you're saying, but have you thought about this? Because like I said, I'm not just thinking about my lake. I'm thinking about all these different lakes I go to. Like I said, I just brought up Guntersville. Guntersville was crazy because you had a bunch of bait up shallow, like all these perch. If you get up there around the grass, just millions of little perch everywhere. No bass to be found. Now, there might have been millions of perch out there in 5 to 8 foot. And when I said no bass to be found, I caught some shallow, yes. But I physically could see when it got dead calm that there would be no bass up there over the grass for like thousands of yards over the grass, like nothing, very few. And there's just bait everywhere. They didn't have to be up there. Maybe they had to be out there in 5 to 8 foot. And maybe there was a bunch of perch I just couldn't physically see with my eyes out there. And then there was fish way on out there deep, right? It all depends on where those bass wanted to go because they had bait everywhere, right? It was just where the bass wanted to be. And that's the part I'm talking about. So yes, I understand sometimes there's bait out there on a point or out there deep and there's a school of fish on them. But I could probably show you hundreds of other spots where there's bait out there and there's no bass on them, right? So the bass are still able to move regardless of where the bait is on most lakes. Now, some lakes that just don't have hardly any bait, those lakes are probably in trouble too. Like those baits are not as good, right? I mean, we're talking about Guntersville, phenomenal lake. We're talking about Rayburn. We can talk about a bunch of different lakes. They're not always out there. And sometimes those bass move based on what bait is available, right? Some of them, what's crazy is you get around some fish and they don't care about shad. They only care about perch. Or they start feeding on nothing but crawfish and perch are swimming all around them. They don't care, right? Or it's crazy. We had shad on Rayburn back in early fall and they were little bitty shad. The small ones were focused on them, but the big ones weren't. And so it all relative, right? There is a whole dynamic of what the bass really want. Like the bass get keyed in on certain bait, certain times of the year, and that's what they're going after. I won't speak about stuff up north because I haven't had that much history on it, right? I haven't done it enough to know what the yellow perch are going to do and all the smallmouth stuff, the gobies and everything else like that. And y'all don't even have shad up there, right? So there's a point in the United States where there's no more shad, right? They can't live in that colder water. And so even like the herring stuff, those herring lakes, right? Everyone thinks about them being all suspended, but those fish just don't feed on herring. A big population of them do at times, but there's still a bunch of perch. There's still a bunch of other things that those fish feed on. And like I said, I think the one thing, and it's crazy because we're the ones throwing most of it, the worms, the crawfish, the things on bottom. I mean, they're eating a bunch of that stuff, but nothing shows that, right? Think about that. Nothing. Oh man, I hope this doesn't come out now. This is going to be like the Live Scope 5.0 is showing crawfish, showing the things on the bottom that they eat, right? Like none of our technology shows that. None of it. I mean, has anyone ever even thought about that, right? We can't go around and go, oh my gosh, look at all the crawfish in the area and this is what they're eating. Or look at the, like, that's the one thing our technology still doesn't show. It can show perch and bait fish and things like that, but it never shows that stuff. So just something to think about. We're going to keep going into this because I like talking about this stuff. But that's what I wanted to talk about, the bait and the fish, and that's not necessarily, I can't sit there and say they're moving because of that, because it doesn't add up to me. But we're going to get on the next one. I'm not getting on, well, I've got two of them. Two of them are going to be hot topics. This next one's going to be a hot topic. It's going to be about tournament fishing. That's one that, I don't know. That one's going to be a lot of opinions, and I just hope some guys, I don't think I'll change anyone's mind on that, but I'm still going to talk about it. All right. Till then, next video. Tournament fishing.